Good afternoon. On behalf of the Philosophy Department, its Chair, Darrell Tress, and its Speakers Committee, I welcome you to the 2020 Suarez Lecture. It's an honor and a pleasure for me to introduce this afternoon's speaker, Linda Zagzebski, the George Lynn Cross Research Professor and holder of the Kingfisher College Chair of the Philosophy of Religion and Ethics at the University of Oklahoma. Professor Zagzebski has authored several important books, including The Dilemma of Freedom and Foreknowledge from Oxford in 1991, Virtues of the Mind, an Inquiry in the Nature of Virtue and the Ethical Foundations of Knowledge at Cambridge in 1996, Divine Motivation Theory from Cambridge again in 2004, Philosophy of Religion and Historical Introduction from Blackwell 2007, on Epistemology, Wadsworth 2008, and Epistemic Authority, A Theory of Trust, Authority, and Autonomy and Belief, again from Oxford in 2012. The Gifford Lectures she delivered at the University of St. Andrews in 2015 are the basis of her most recent book, Exemplarist Moral Theory, once again from Oxford in 2017. And Professor Zagzebski has edited several volumes and authored more than 100 articles, but I don't think I'll read the whole list. I should also note that Professor Zagzebski is a past president of the American Catholic Philosophical Association in 1996 to 7, when I had the good fortune to work with her on the association's executive council. She is also past president of the Society of Christian Philosophers from 2004 to 2007, and past president of the Central Division of the American Philosophical Association in 2015 and 16. The lecture will be followed by a question period of approximately 30 minutes. You can submit a question at any time during the lecture by using the Q&A function found at the bottom of the webinar screen. I'll relay the questions for you and we'll get through as many of them as we can. Perhaps I'll help that process by combining a couple of similar questions if the occasion arises. So the title of Professor Zagzebski's lecture today is The Two Greatest Ideas. And however it is that you engage in virtual applause, please join me in welcoming Professor Zagzebski to Fordham University. Linda.
Thank you so much, John. And I want to thank you and the Fordham University Philosophy Department for this invitation and the opportunity to share with you a project in the history of ideas that I have been working on for the last few years. I'm writing an interpretation of human civilization as the interplay of two ideas. And what I'm going to do in this lecture is give you a brief overview of my book manuscript called The Two Greatest Ideas. And it will, of course, have to be sketchy, but I hope that you will find something in it to pique your interest. I know that what is called grand narratives are out of style because of the fear that such narratives are usually polemical, and whether intentionally or not, they support the power of one group of people over another. But my aim is to be as sympathetic as possible to both our modern and our pre-modern history, but to acknowledge that conflicts within that history have left us with a legacy of conceptual conflict. And I will try to offer hope for the resolution of those conflicts, even though I don't pretend to know how to accomplish that. What I'm going to do is present with a PowerPoint. So I will attempt to start the PowerPoints right now. I hope people can see it. John, does it look okay to you? I actually couldn't hear you, but I saw you nod. Okay. So is the sound okay? Everything is all right? Okay. Now, what I'm going to argue is that there have been two, let's see, I'm having a little trouble moving this. Why is that the case? I do not seem to be in, okay, just a minute. Okay, I think it's on the slideshow format right now. So I'm going to argue that there have been two ideas in human history that underlie a vast number of the intellectual innovations of human civilization. These ideas are so simple that it is easy to overlook their tremendous power, and it is easy to forget that we did not always have them. One is the idea that the human mind is capable of grasping the universe, meaning all of reality. And the other is the idea that the human mind is capable of grasping itself. I'm going to tell a story about these two ideas and how their relationship changed from the dominance of the first to the dominance of the second. And now that their uneasy relationship has led to cultural conflict, there are signs of the possible rise of a third great idea. The first great idea might seem obvious to us because it is implied by so many of our broad cultural practices: religion, philosophy, natural science, mathematics. All of these practices attempt to discover something universal: the numerical laws of the universe, its physical structure, the origin and future of the universe, and possibly our ultimate destiny. But I wonder why anybody would get the idea that that is possible. They would have to think of the entire universe as a unified whole, tied together by laws rather than a jumble of discrete phenomena, and possibly originating from a creative mind. But such an idea is not forced on us. In fact, thousands of years of human progress did not rely on it. From earliest times, all the societies of which we have evidence had the ability to work with objects and manipulate them. But such accomplishments as creating metals and fashioning them into tools, developing building techniques, cultivating crops, and raising animals do not require that the thought that the world is one unified whole. Much less do they require that the thought that the human mind can grasp it. Probably any invention relies on the belief that there are regularities in nature, but it is not necessary to think that the human mind can grasp the world as a whole to invent fire or to make a pot or to plant crops. The same point applies to simple forms of the decorative arts and the ability to tell a story. In fact, people could tell stories about the gods without thinking that they could grasp the universe. So the first great idea was not necessary for ancient mythology, and religion does not necessarily include the first great idea. But in the most dramatic leap in the evolution of human thought, people got the idea that we can understand the world as a whole. We can see through the plenitude of phenomena in our experience to see the world as a unity. People have occasionally raised the curious question of why philosophy, mathematics, science, and the great world religions were all started at approximately the same time, generally regarded to be the first millennium BCE. And I'm suggesting that all these achievements were connected with the rise of the first great idea. The first great idea might seem grandiose, but when I say that the first idea was an idea, I do not mean that it was necessarily a belief, although it probably is and has been a belief for many people. People can entertain an idea long before they believe it to be true, and even if they never believe it to be true. The first idea is the idea of a possibility, something that the human mind is capable of doing. For some people, the idea might function as an aspiration or a hope rather than a belief. For others, it is clearly a belief, even a commitment. But the power of the idea does not depend upon its being true. In Western history, philosophy is usually traced to the 6th century BCE, with 3 philosophers who lived in the Greek city of Miletus in present-day Turkey, and were probably among the first human beings to get the idea of the world as a whole. The first philosopher on record is Thales, and I'm sorry to say that for decades I did not appreciate the significance of Thales' proposal that water is the foundation of the world. In my experience, students generally find Thales and his successors silly, but the idea that there's some primary substance out of which the entire world is composed was genius of the first order. It was the first instance of the idea that the universe is one thing, an idea that has guided human intellectual and material advancement ever since. Anaximander's proposal that the origin and principle of all things is the boundless or the infinite was particularly impressive, not only for the content of the idea, but for the fact that he attempted to demonstrate it by argument. Anaximander's urge to map reality extended to mapping the stars and drawing a map of the world, making him one of the first geographers and first astronomers. Think how significant it is that the same person who had the metaphysical idea of the boundless was also an astronomer and a geographer. In order to map the stars and the earth and reason about the origin of the universe, he had to have the first great idea. He believed that everything that exists is connected in a structure that can be mapped, and it can be mapped in a way that a human being can grasp and communicate to other minds. The Pythagoreans expanded the first great idea in a way that allowed them to integrate virtually all domains of human thought to a degree that has never been surpassed. Through their discovery that the structure of the universe is numerical, they were able to connect physics and metaphysics with mathematics. And since they understood the mathematical ratios of musical harmony, they were able to put aesthetic enjoyment at the core of their picture of the universe, an idea that has now been almost completely lost. It might seem accidental that the Pythagoreans also believed in an afterlife and had a disciplined moral code, but I think that that is unsurprising, given the central place of the first great idea in their thought. They extended laws of harmony to the human soul and to the state, producing a unitary view on the nature of the entire material and non-material universe. Because of the Pythagoreans and the other pre-Socratic philosophers, the ancient Greeks created and left to us a legacy so close to universally acknowledged as to be invisible, that the universe in its entirety is rationally ordered. We still expect all areas of human thought and activity to be connected because we have inherited the idea that the entire universe is comprehensible, and it is comprehensible because it is, in a very important sense, one thing. We have never given that up. Evidence that we have not given it up is that we have never given up the word universe. I want to stress that the first great idea was not just the idea that there is a universe with a unified rational structure. It was the idea that the human mind thinks it is grasping such a universe. The awareness of being able to grasp the universe as a whole transformed human consciousness. The first great idea was a big idea, and so it took a big mind to have it. The awareness of having a big mind must have given the Pythagoreans a sense of power. It led them to the idea that the soul can rise to union with the divine, and that idea occurs repeatedly in the major world religions. We see it in the Hindu Upanishads, in Buddhism, in Neoplatonism, and later in the great metaphysical systems of the West, such as those of Aquinas and Spinoza. The first great idea gave human beings a sense of harmony with the universe, and that led them to a view of morality that has persisted through long periods of history in many cultures, the idea that morality is living and feeling in accord with the world. There is another way in which the first idea led to morality. Grasping the human place in the universe as a whole not only leads to the aspiration to an afterlife or union between the individual mind and the highest power, but also to a sense of responsibility to God or the highest power. When the members of our species came to regard themselves as important, they realized that their actions are serious. Moral laws are not just rules to get along with a minimum of violence. They are laws demanded of beings whose grasp of the universe makes them answerable to the universe. So before Socrates, Greek philosophers had managed to both originate and connect metaphysics, natural science, mathematics, musical theory, morality, and a type of religious vision that did not appear in the Greek religion. Elsewhere in the world, the first great idea took the form of the beginning of a world religion: Hinduism, Buddhism, Zoroastrianism, Taoism, Judaism. But in Greece, the first great idea was originated by philosophy rather than the Greek religion, making the Greeks unique in the history of that idea. The first idea transformed the way humans think of themselves, and that explains why the first idea also led to the experience of conversion. But there are forms of the first great idea that are not transformative, as we will see. Monotheism is one of the most important and enduring ideas in human history, and it was explicitly adopted by the Jews no later than the 7th century BCE, a century before the school of Pythagoras flourished in southern Italy. In the Hebrew scriptures, monotheism raised the first great idea to the level of the personal. What made it personal was partly that it included the idea that the whole natural universe comes from the choice of a personal being. And it was personal also because it included the idea that a human person can have a relationship with the personal creator. The paramount expression of Jewish monotheism appears in Deuteronomy. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength. This is the definitive statement of Jewish identity. And notice that it expresses both a metaphysical claim about God and a claim about the Jewish people's relationship with God. It is a version of the first great idea in which personhood is at the core. The idea that the universe was created by the choice of a personal deity had some important implications. It meant that although the universe is comprehensible, it did not come into being out of necessity, and therefore it could not be comprehended by a priori reflection. Since the features of the universe are contingent, they have to be discovered. The belief in the contingency of the world is one of the metaphysical presuppositions of modern science, which arguably can be traced back to the ancient Jews, who seem to have been unique among ancient peoples in thinking of the universe as contingent rather than necessary, and linear rather than cyclical. Monotheism was also connected with the idea that there are moral laws that apply to all human beings. Even before the Jews were clearly monotheistic, they had a covenant with God who required of them that they obey his moral prescriptions. But at some point, they began to see some of those prescriptions as universal. There are hints of this idea as far back as the early 8th century BC, at the beginning of the book of Amos, where monotheism is connected with a moral law that is not tied to a particular culture. Amos declares that not only the Israelites, but also the inhabitants of neighboring kingdoms will be judged by God for their evil acts. The Israelite neighbors could not use the excuse that their behavior was endorsed by their local gods. That was significant for the development of the belief that there are moral prescriptions that cross the boundaries of particular societies, and it eventually led to the idea that there are universal moral laws. The idea of a natural law that we see in many ancient peoples, and especially in Stoicism, was developed by Aquinas many centuries later into the idea that there's a single eternal law of God that is expressed in the created world in both a universal moral law and a universal physical law. The idea of a universal moral law eventually led to the modern idea of universal rights, and the idea of a universal physical law was a condition for the development of modern science. So in Western history, we see a connected move from early physics and metaphysics and mathematics and ethics, and then eventually to modern natural science and international law, all of which are connected with the first great idea. But the form that the first great idea took in the West faltered. After more than 2,000 years of dominance, the first great idea declined, and the second great idea overtook it. The pivotal period in the confrontation of the two great ideas was the era that we now call modern, roughly starting in the 17th, 18th centuries. And here my story takes a turn. The second great idea, that the human mind is capable of grasping itself, probably arose at about the same time as the first. But for millennia, the second idea was secondary to the first. That does not mean that people did not reflect on their minds. In fact, in both the East and the West, there were highly developed practices of prayer and meditation that focused on the mind. But the purpose of these practices was usually the desire to grasp something else. For example, God, or Brahman, or the Tao, or the One. The individual mind was not thought to be important in itself. What human beings thought of their own minds derived from their idea of the place of the mind in the totality of reality. Since human minds are a component of the world as a whole, the first great idea, that the human mind can grasp the world, included the second idea, that the human mind can grasp itself. In the West, that meant that there was a distinct order of knowing. Human beings know themselves primarily through knowing the world. We grasp the world first, and because we grasp the world, we can grasp ourselves. One's own mind is not transparent to itself, and it is not the primary object of awareness. When the first great idea dominated, the distinctiveness of consciousness was not an issue, and the distinctiveness of an individual consciousness was certainly not an issue. People probably notice that there's something different about grasping one's own mind than grasping minds in general. But there was little or no attention to the idea that the mind's grasp of itself differs in kind from the mind's grasp of the universe, even that part of the universe that contains minds. What was missing in the pre-modern versions of the first great idea was the idea of subjectivity, the idea that when a human mind grasps itself, it grasps something that is unique. I do not see any indication that the uniqueness of individual consciousness was treated with any more importance than the uniqueness of the human body for most of human history. People no doubt experienced the uniqueness of others, particularly those they loved, but the idea of the individuality of consciousness did not change anything in the way philosophers thought of the place of the human being in the universe. Nor did it change the practice of religion, nor did it change the practice of morality. It is commonplace to observe that the early modern period was important, and I dislike repeating a commonplace, but I am convinced that the second most dramatic event in the history of human thought really did happen around the 17th century in Europe. The idea that the human mind can grasp itself took on a degree of importance that separated it from the idea that the human mind can grasp the universe. Starting with Descartes or thereabouts, the second great idea began to supersede the first. There are a number of things to note about this historic change. First, the second idea would not have risen to such importance if the first idea had not faltered. The unity of the study of nature and human destiny and morality started to fall apart. Descartes would not have made the second idea the starting point of an entire method of philosophy if he had been satisfied with the first. He says that explicitly. The Reformation of the 16th century had broken the unitary authority of the Christian religion in expressing the version of the first great idea that virtually everyone accepted. Since morality had been connected with religious authority, the undermining of religious authority led to the undermining of the conception of morality as obedience to authority, the voice of God expressed in human institutions, preparing the way for a new foundation of morality in individual autonomy. Aristotelian natural science, which had long been a component of the medieval worldview, was found to be defective, and was replaced by the new empirical science. The religious wars and the Black Death dismantled the medieval economy and the social and political structures that had embodied a common expression of the first great idea. Of course, the disarray in a particular version of the first idea is no reason to give up the first idea itself, and the first great idea continued to fare well in Eastern thought. But in the West, the effect of philosophy and historical events on the first idea was devastating. Eventually, in the minds of many, the only version of the first great idea left standing was the conception of the world produced by natural science. Before Descartes, the rise of the second great idea had already begun, with advances in a number of fields. Discoveries in perspective geometry by the Arabs were brought to Florence in the 15th century, making it possible to depict visual works from a consciously chosen point of view. The discovery of perspective not only led to the glorious art and architecture of the Renaissance, it produced innovations in optics, in navigation, and astronomy, so its importance went well beyond its usefulness in depicting an image in three-dimensional space on a flat surface. The ability to depict points of view did not simply make painting more realistic. It led to a greater awareness of the existence of different points of view and the individual minds that possess them. Literature was revolutionized at the same time as art, with the invention of a new form of literature in which the point of view of the characters is the focus of the narrative. 36 years before Descartes published his Meditations, Cervantes published the first part of Don Quixote, universally regarded as the first modern novel and one of the most influential works of fiction ever written. What made Don Quixote revolutionary was the invention of characters, each of whom is not just a type, but is like a real person with a world of their own and a unique point of view. We are so used to the second great idea that we do not often pay attention to the origin of its supremacy, but its rise required a revolution on many levels in philosophy, in art, and literature. I think that it is important to see that the two great ideas are not in conflict, but they were interpreted that way when the second idea superseded the first. What was dramatic about the ascendance of the second great idea was the shift from the view that the human mind grasps itself through grasping the world to the idea that the human mind grasps the world through grasping itself. Philosophers began to think that one's consciousness is the gateway through which all knowledge of the world must pass. I know many philosophers who find this idea so obviously true as not to require argument. But actually, it is not obvious at all. When an idea becomes so widely accepted that it appears trivial, it's easy to forget and to misread the work of millennia of writers who did not accept it. When the first great idea dominated, philosophers thought of the mind as an open window to the universe. Theories of perception in this period were typically forms of direct realism. What you perceive is what is there in the world when all goes well. When the second great idea dominated, philosophers thought that we need to construct our idea of the world out of the contents of our minds. The mind has a boundary, so the relationship between mental contents and the world outside became critical. Perceptual theories were either forms of indirect realism, what you perceive as a copy of what is in the world, or idealism, what you perceive as an idea, and the world is a world of ideas. Either way, the grasp of the mind comes first. The mind takes in perceptions and then has to figure out what kind of world would produce those perceptions. There are other important shifts. No longer did philosophy begin with metaphysics, the study of being qua being. Instead, epistemology became first philosophy. The metaphysical study of human beings shifted from a focus on persons as having a place in nature to a focus on the self as the bearer of individual subjective consciousness. The consequence was a dramatic shift from the idea of morality as living in harmony with the universe to the idea of morality as grounded in self-governance or autonomy. It is not surprising that the second great idea led to far more skepticism about the human ability to comprehend the universe than an approach that made the first idea basic. If you have to start with the contents of your own mind and then try to figure out how to infer from them what the universe outside your mind is like, you have a job that might be insurmountable at the first step. And even if you can get beyond the skeptical threat, you will find it difficult to construct a view of the world with anything like the comprehensiveness of the great religions or the great metaphysical systems of the past. So the dominance of the idea that the mind precedes the world had a deflating effect on traditional metaphysics and theology and any attempt at a grand worldview. The second idea did not destroy the first idea in all forms. One of its most important philosophical forms was the British empiricism of the 18th century. Not the kind of empiricism of Aristotle, where you look around you and investigate, but the only kind of empiricism possible when you have to construct all the materials of the world out of your perceptual states. That made empirical science foundational. It also made it possible to treat the universe of mental states as a complete universe. So it is not surprising that the rise of the second great idea led to the empirical idealism of George Berkeley, in which all objects are in minds, and by a different path to the idealism of Hegel, in which the history of the world is the history of consciousness. So the dominance of the second idea was accompanied by, and partly caused by, the rise of modern science and its breathtaking success in improving human lives, as well as advancing our knowledge of the physical world. In the minds of many, the combination of trust in science and lack of trust in the Christian worldview led to the idea that science is capable of giving us a theory of everything. And that reduced the first idea to empirical science. But science did not transform human consciousness the way earlier versions of the first idea had done. And here there is a serious problem. Earlier, I said that the first idea gave human beings a sense of power and importance. When it diminished, the beliefs that had given people meaning were gone, and what was left was the idea of scientific and technological progress. By the 20th century, Max Weber famously declared that science undermines religion, not only theology, by revealing a reality devoid of meaning and value and devoid of the presence of God, and therefore disenchanted. The focus on consciousness required that there be laws of consciousness. Otherwise, there would be no way to tie it to the external world. I see Kant as the pivotal figure because we see two sides of Kant, both of which have continued in the last 2.5 centuries. One side of Kant strengthened the rise of the second great idea. Kant had argued that when we apply the tools that we use to understand the world to the understanding itself, we see that these tools are deficient. There is an important distinction between a person as part of the world and a person as seen from inside the mind. A person is a being in the world seen as a whole. A self is a being as seen from inside its own mind. The self is a category only because of the rise of the second great idea. This side of Kant led to the modern emphasis on the importance of the self, to the existentialism of Kierkegaard and Nietzsche, and to phenomenology, and it explains the rise of autonomy as a political and moral ideal. But post-Kantian thought also includes the extension of the side of Kant that expressed the first great idea, the idea that there's a universal law of rationality. And this idea has nothing to do with my particular consciousness or yours. I believe that Kant should get credit for trying to give equal importance to both of the great ideas, and the two ideas confront each other in Kant's work. For instance, in his attempt to make autonomy both the value of an individual's self-direction and the universal value of rationality. But it seems to me that in Kant's work, the second great idea is ultimately victorious. As much as he wanted to retain the first great idea, he thought that he had discovered that what we grasp when we think we grasp the universe is not the universe in itself, but the universe as an object of possible experience. For many philosophers, that was the final nail in the coffin of the first great idea. The discovery of subjectivity revealed a problem with the pre-modern conception of the world. And it also produced a new problem for the era of the second great idea. The discovery of subjectivity meant that people in the pre-modern period must have made a mistake when they thought they'd successfully exercised the power expressed in the first great idea. They thought they had grasped the world as a whole when they had not, because what they grasped was missing their subjectivity. And if subjectivity is real, it was missing something real. But people since the modern period began have not been able to integrate subjectivity into a conception of the whole universe. The discovery of subjectivity brought with it the dichotomy between the subjective world, the world of your unique conscious experience, and the objective world, the world without conscious experience. But the objective world is not the whole world. The legacy of the discovery of subjectivity was a sharp division between areas of human culture that express subjectivity, such as art and literature, and those that aim at a grasp of the objective world, such as science. If both the subjective world and the objective world are real, a successful expression of the first great idea would have to include both. Neither the era dominated by the first great idea nor the era dominated by the second succeeded in forming a conception of the whole of reality. The result has been confusion because the desire to have a comprehensive conception of reality has never gone away. We are still struggling to understand how our mind connects with the world, and this struggle affects the way we think of who we are. We each think of ourselves as a person, a being in the world as a whole, and a self, a person experienced on the inside, and they are not the same thing. The emphasis on the person is connected with the first great idea, and it led to a morality of harmony with God or nature and the civic community, because a person is defined by membership in a species or a community. The emphasis on the self arose with the dominance of the second great idea, and it led to a morality of autonomy as the fundamental value. This difference resulted in conflict, or at least ambivalence, about many public issues. People frequently refer to autonomy to support positions on a wide range of issues, from abortion to environmental ethics, to gun ownership, to economic policies, to the right to say what one wants. And notice that the autonomy position does not consistently line up with what people usually label conservative or liberal. In the abortion debate, the focus on autonomy is considered the liberal position, while in the gun rights debate, it is conservative. In the dispute about offensive speech, the autonomy position is labeled conservative, whereas autonomy about gender and sexual identity is considered liberal. In environmental ethics, the deep ecology movement went as far as any movement I know of outside of religious ethics to make harmony with nature the fundamental moral imperative, and it clearly arises out of the first great idea, yet it's considered progressive. Rather than to categorize our conflicts by the standard labels conservative versus liberal or traditional versus progressive, I suggest that we attend to the deep conceptual background of these conflicts in our inheritance of the two great ideas, which are not in conflict, but which were interpreted in the eras in which each of them dominated in a way that does appear to conflict. Do we think of morality as harmony with the world or as grounded in individual autonomy? Where does subjectivity fit into the world as a whole? As I have said, the two great ideas are not in conflict, so it ought to be possible to put them together, even though their dominant historical expressions were in conflict. But it is our misfortune that we have never figured out how to put both of the two great ideas together in a way that maintains the reach of the versions of the first great idea achieved by the great world religions and the great metaphysical systems of the West, as well as the vibrant recognition and expression of subjectivity that we get in literature and art and some of the great philosophical systems, such as existentialism. We understand subjectivity primarily through our grasp of our own minds, and the focus on one's mind led to the recognition that the expressions of the first great idea before the modern era were missing something. But something important was missing from the exercise of both of the great ideas, and that is the subjectivity of other minds. When the second great idea rose to prominence, it created the modern world, and it was enough for each mind to think of itself as a self with an inside world. But the idea that each self is unique could not have come from the second idea alone. It must have taken another idea to reveal the differences between the subjective world of oneself and that of another. This idea is so important, it deserves to be the third great idea, and it is the idea that the human mind can grasp another mind. I say it deserves to be a great idea, but I don't think it is yet. All three of the ideas I have discussed must have been around as long as there have been reflective humans in existence. But what made each of the first two ideas a great idea was that it led to cultural innovation and sometimes upheaval, and was expressed in more than one cultural form, art, science, literature, philosophy, having long-lasting effects. The third idea, as important as it is, has not yet had deep cultural effects equal to the effects of the first and second great ideas. What we need, I think, is a revolution in the science of subjectivity and intersubjectivity that explains the connection between the subjective world of one mind and another, and the connection between the subjective and objective worlds. We see pockets of research on intersubjectivity in many fields. For example, in neuroscience, I'm thinking of research on mirror neurons. In psychology and education theory, there's considerable research in recent years on empathy. In political theory, I know of work on overcoming polarization in democratic deliberation through intersubjective experiences and empathy. There's also interdisciplinary work connecting philosophical work on intersubjectivity with the science of the mind. So we have many different examples of research on intersubjectivity. But what we do not have as yet is a revolution in the science of subjectivity. What made modern science revolutionary for human understanding is that it is a practice in which large numbers of people cooperate, permitting the advancement of knowledge on a vast scale and with a method to determine when it succeeds and when it does not. We need a revolution that does for the study of subjectivity what the scientific revolution did for our understanding of the objective world. I think our best hope to understand how our subjectivity fits into the world as a whole is a breakthrough in the study of intersubjectivity. The individual human mind has infinite powers of inclusion. That is the genius of the first idea. But it also is excluded from everything else. We get that from the second and third ideas. Each individual consciousness has a uniqueness that resists incorporation into any full description of the universe anyone has ever offered. Until we can figure out how to get that to make sense, we will not have a comprehensive view of reality, and we will not have the ability to use the power of our minds to live in harmony with the world and with other persons. We will not even understand ourselves. Thank you very much for listening.
Thanks very much, Linda. That was wonderful and very provocative. And I have a few, since it was a large topic, the questions are kind of large as well. So the first one, what are the key differences you see between the reflective self-grasping that Descartes does in comparison to, say, Augustine? For both, the mind is mathematically discrete from other minds, but not particularly interesting qua uniqueness for either. One might even argue that Augustine had a more morally interesting engagement with and reflection on the individuality of his consciousness. I get the idea that the notion of perspectival particularity is central to what you are asserting, and certainly more available to Descartes than Augustine, but it doesn't seem that that's all you mean by the explicit thought about the uniqueness of the mind. Or is the instrumentality of the grasp of the mind, its capacity to lead to science, etc., what is most important in dating the real shift?
Oh, wonderful. So I would like to answer that question by saying something about Augustine and then something about Descartes. I did not say anything about Augustine in this lecture, but I do have a rather extensive exploration of Augustine in the book manuscript. And I'm not completely sure what to say about Augustine. I think that Augustine is often interpreted as being a man way ahead of his time. You know, he was a man whose ability to self-reflect far exceeded what was common or in any of the philosophers at the time. But I do think it's interesting that a comment that Bakhtin made about Augustine has made me think about that a bit, because Bakhtin said that in Augustine, it is meant to be something that would be heard by other people. And I'm not sure that's true, but it is worth considering the difference between meditations that are meant for oneself and meditations on one's mind, which are meant to be heard or read or understood by other people. So I'm quite willing to say that Augustine was way before his time and is a great example of the penetrating respect for the second great idea and thinking and being able to express it in the written word far before anybody else did. Now about Descartes, there's a different question that I hear raised here about Descartes, because the question is not so much about whether Descartes was engaging in self-reflection, individual self-reflection, but on how far he was able to think of individual consciousness as unique. And I'm quite willing to say that I do not see a lot of evidence that Descartes thought of subjectivity in the full sense that I've been describing, which is the experience of individual consciousness as unique. It's interesting to me that we see more uniqueness expressed in Cervantes' Don Quixote, 36 years before Descartes' Meditations, than we do in Descartes. So when I talk about the rise of the second great idea, I don't think we see the full idea in Descartes. We see part of the idea in Descartes. We see part of the idea in the art of the time, art of the Renaissance preceding Descartes, and we see it in the invention of the novel. So I think that actually the rise of the second great idea was a revolution that occurred on many levels, in many different fields. So I guess I'm acknowledging both of the points I think I heard in the question. One about Augustine preceding his time or being a forerunner of the second great idea, and also that Descartes did not do, I don't think he did had the full idea of subjectivity that I'm talking about.
Okay, thanks, Linda. I have another question here for you. You used the notion of grasping in your articulation of both of the great ideas. What is grasping? And is it roughly the same in both cases for the two ideas? Does the significant difference in object, the world, and the mind lead to significantly different kinds of grasping?
That's a wonderful question. I mean, I think I'm hearing more than one question. One question is, what is grasping? And then the other question is there a different kind of grasping when the mind grasps the world than when the mind grasps itself? For the first question, what is grasping? I doubt that I'm able to give an answer that's very satisfying. At a minimum, we think of grasping as a kind of a contact. I mean, there's a different kinds of grasping. Your hand grasps the doorknob. It sort of covers it up. But there's another kind of grasp that's just a sort of seeing or a making contact, making visual contact or auditory contact or tactile contact. And all of these words I'm using are metaphors. The word grasping itself is a metaphor for something that I'm proposing that the mind does. And so I don't know how to answer the question in a way that doesn't use the metaphors. Grasping is a word I actually kind of like because it seems to me less theoretically loaded than words like understand, which I actually do use sometimes. But so that's about all I can actually say about what the word means or what I mean by it. Then the second question about whether the mind grasps the world in a different way than the way the mind grasps itself, I think the answer to that question must be yes, it must be different. And the reason it must be different is that we wouldn't have thought of the two great ideas as different ideas if we hadn't thought we were doing different kinds of things when we're grasping the world and grasping ourselves. It's not just the object is different, but that the act itself has something fundamentally different about it. And so when I'm suggesting that these two great ideas really are fundamental driving ideas in the history of human civilization, it seems unlikely to me that we would have thought that, or these ideas would have seemed separate from each other, different from each other, if it hadn't been for the fact that the mind is doing something, a different type of grasping when it grasps the world than when it grasps itself. If you want me to explain or describe what the difference is, I'm afraid I'm going to have trouble doing that. And if anybody has any suggestions, I would welcome that.
Okay, thank you. Okay, here's a question about the origin of the great ideas. The second idea may have arisen by historical circumstances that eroded confidence in the first great idea. Do you have thoughts about what gave rise to the first? How is it that it arises in the mid-first millennium BCE, but not earlier?
Okay. First of all, let me clarify something in my lecture. I did not mean to be suggesting that the second great idea did not appear until the modern era. I think the second great idea was around all along. What happened in the early modern period was that it rose in importance to actually supersede the first great idea. But I think the second great idea has been around as long as people have been around thinking. So probably as long as the human race has been around, both of those ideas were around. The issue was the connection between them. The first great idea really is the greatest idea. I mean, I'd have no hesitation in saying that the first great idea is the greatest idea of all. And why did it a rise in the first millennium BC? I don't know. I can't say. I was connecting the rise of the first great idea with the origin of philosophy, the origin of the great world religions, the invention of mathematics, of the origin of science. They all are human activities that seem to be forms or presuppose the first great idea. But I'm not suggesting that the first great idea preceded the invention of mathematics and philosophy and the world religions. It accompanied them, or these different fields of human culture, art, philosophy, science, not art. Art, actually, I have a different story on art, but science, philosophy, the world religions, and mathematics all were expressions of this idea. I don't know what made people think of it, but once they thought of it in all sorts of ways at roughly the same time. So it can't be an accident that the beginning of systematic mathematics, the beginning of science, and the beginning of philosophy were all at about the same time.
Okay, thank you. Another question, how do we measure the dominance of one idea over another? For example, there are key early modern figures such as Leibniz and Spinoza, where the second idea does not seem nearly as prominent as in Descartes. More generally, might the offered interpretation of the early modern period overstate the central importance of, quote, the veil of ideas, unquote, and external world skepticism to the culture of the era, compared to other important early modern issues like religious war, the rise of absolute monarchy, shifting attitudes towards natural teleology, etc.?
Okay, so let me make sure I understood the question. So the question is, there are important figures in philosophy such as Leibniz and Spinoza who were definitely not dominated by the second great idea. Descartes was. And why, and so exactly what is the question is why, could you say that again, John? What is it?
How do we measure dominance?
How do we tell which is the dominant one? Yeah, right. Okay, good. Well, I guess that I was proposing that what makes ideas great is that they lead to cultural innovations in a lot of different fields, and they last for a long time. And I guess, I mean, this is a question of how you interpret the influence of Descartes versus the influence of Leibniz and Spinoza in subsequent philosophy, in philosophy in later centuries. And it does seem to me that the idea that we grasp the mind before the world began to take hold on philosophy for several hundred years, and also was expressed in other cultural endeavors like like literature and art. And I don't want in any way to demean Leibniz and Spinoza and my love, but I guess I am suggesting that their historical influence was overshadowed by not just Descartes, but the broader idea that the mind precedes the world. And you see that in British empiricism and then a whole chain of philosophy after that.
Okay, thanks. So here's yet another. What about the spiritual practices in many religious or spiritual traditions that are about erasure or abandonment of the self, or even a merging of the self with the universe? The idea of grasping another seems deeply problematic. For example, Levinas suggests it's the origin of totalitarianism. And maybe the idea of grasping the self is equally problematic in some ways.
The idea of grasping the self is problematic. Could you ask the first part of the question? Because
I think the idea is it's a question about the erasure or abandonment of the self.
Abandonment of the self.
Yeah.
Okay,
in religious
that's
practices.
a little different. Yeah. Okay. So one question is about philosophies and religions in which abandonment of the self is dominant. And another question has to do with grasping the self, whether there's something questionable about that. Yeah, okay, so I have very little to say in my book about the no self view and about Buddhism. I don't know very much about it. My narrative is intended to be a narrative that explains the evolution of certain trains of thought and themes in Western philosophy, which have eventually led to both intellectual and practical political conflicts in the West. Now, I've set up a problem, and there's more than one possible solution to the problem. So the kind of solution I am suggesting is to have a revolution in the study of intersubjectivity. That would help us both in our theoretical problems of trying to understand the relationship between the mind and the world, and many of our practical and political problems. But that's not the only solution there could be, because we could see several times in the book, I mentioned that it's always a good idea to pay attention to alternative ways that the history of ideas have gone in the East. And particularly Buddhism is one example where there is a totally different view about the connection between the self and the world, or even the existence of the self. That's one, that line of thought could be a solution to the kinds of problems that we have in the West. It would be a solution that would say, go back and start over again, rather than, keep going. So my proposals in the book have to do with, here's a problem of conflict that we have inherited. Let's be respectful of our whole history and just see how far we can get out of it just by moving forward. But there's always the solution of just going back and jettisoning some of the philosophical work of the last several hundred years and taking a whole different tack. So I'm not opposed to that at all. The question about there's something wrong or about grasping the self, I'm not sure I caught how that's supposed to work. What would be, I don't know if you want to add anything, or I don't really have anything to say about that. Why there would be, I guess I don't see why there would be.
I think it was just the other side of the abandonment issue that.
Yeah, I see. Yeah, okay.
Here, a question. Would you say that your account hews fairly close to Jasper's on emphasizing the idea of the cosmic whole, and that this whole is mentally comprehensible? I think the idea of the whole is apparent in earlier mythology, but the great idea that makes all the difference is that ethical ideals are not the same as the sacred, having to do with cosmogonic origin. The core of this turns on the idea that might does not make right, and we recognize sources of justification that are not coercion. I think that question covers a lot of ground.
It covers a lot of ground, yeah. The suggestion was that I'm somewhat like Jaspers in thinking about the world as a whole. And maybe you could repeat what
Well,
alternative there is, or what.
And that the whole is comprehensible.
Right.
And then the question traces the idea of the whole back to earlier mythology.
Yeah, right.
But the important innovation is that ethical ideals are different from the sacred.
Okay.
So there's a source of justification that's not coercion.
Okay. Well, I'm not sure about the coercion part, but yes. This question actually relates to the earlier question about what gave people the idea that they could grasp the world as a whole. Like, where did the first great idea come from? And I do have done some thinking about what the Frankfurts called mythopoeic thought, which they claimed 60 years ago preceded philosophical thinking, and where they think of philosophical thinking as being systematic. And mythology often is stories about a whole, but it's a whole that has emotional and personal structure to it, rather than rational laws, rather than a structure that you could express in laws. So the idea that we can grasp a whole, that the universe is personal, and like persons, it's not predictable, it's not law-like, it has a will. The Nile decides to rise. The sun decides to rise, etc. That nature is infused with human-like personal features that are not law-like and make it unpredictable. That is very different from the idea that the universe is structured in a way that a mind can comprehend, precisely for the reasons that those features are not personal. They're systematic, they're law-like, they might be numerical, expressed in mathematics. Those are two different ways of looking at what it would mean for the universe to be a whole, or be one thing. I'm not sure what to say. I'm not sure I understood the coercion part of the question. That what was discovered when there were ethical laws discovered, I'm not sure, maybe that could be clarified. I didn't understand where the coercion, what would be coercive or not coercive.
Yeah, the only thing that I saw was that maybe the idea is that unlike something like Stoicism, where the moral is just cohering with the law of the universe, the mythological ideals, ethical ideals, would be divorced from that kind of law-like governance of the world, that where the goal is to conform, in some
conform
sense,
to the law
with the law. Yeah.
And that conforming to the law is the coercive aspect?
I take it that that's what's meant, but
I see.
I don't know.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So I'm not sure how to say that, because the way I'm thinking of it, in the era dominated by the first great idea, which of course is a long time and includes many cultures, the ethical ideal was harmony with the universe. Harmony with the universe, in the way I'm thinking of it, is not coercive. It's a matter of fitting in to the universe, fitting your part. You have a part in it. You have a part in a whole, in a greater whole, and you are fulfilling your part in the whole. Now, I just suppose that could be interpreted as coercive, but I wasn't thinking of it that way.
Okay.
So.
So here's another one. I'd be curious to hear about the connection between monotheism and the contingency of the world. Some thinkers, for example, Avicenna, held that God, even if provided with a will, created the world necessarily, so that it is impossible for the world not to exist, and it is impossible for it to be organized in a different way. So could you elaborate a bit about the sense of contingency that you're thinking of and why it's significant?
Yes, I guess I was influenced by some writers. Their names are slipping my mind at the moment, but there have been people who've argued that it's not an accident that modern science sort of evolved out of the sense that there is a universe created by a God who makes what could have been otherwise. And so if it could have been otherwise, we couldn't figure out how the universe is constructed by a priori reasoning. We would have to go out and look to see what makes it the way it is. The features of the universe would be discoverable if they're contingent. If they're necessary, the idea is, then it would not be so important to do empirical observation. You could figure it out by reasoning. Now, I take the point that even if, you could say, look, even if God could only make the universe one way, we're not going to be able to figure it out by our own powers of reasoning what that way is. We're still going to have to look. So I take that as an objection that I'll have to think about. But I was repeating a line of a historical interpretation that I have heard, that the Jewish idea of the contingency of the world and the linearity of the world, that the universe isn't cyclical, that actually was part of the background that gave rise, or made possible, the rise of modern science. Okay,
thanks. We're just about out of time. We're not going to be able to get to all the questions. Do you have time for one more?
Sure.
Yeah. Okay. So what if we were to say that the two great ideas are two great mistakes? Why should the mind have been right at the outset anyhow? The third idea may lead to the non-mistake of rejecting the subject-object dichotomy in the first place, as is the case in process thought, and the example given is Whitehead. And another questioner mentions Hannah Arendt on the same point. And of course, I would add the phenomenologists.
Yeah, sure.
Deny this distinction as well.
Right.
So
yes, in fact, I that's very good. I like this a lot. I like the phenomenological idea that we wouldn't have the idea of the subject and we wouldn't have the idea of the object without intersubjective experience. I like that. And I don't know how far to go with it. But if it turned out that my proposal, it's not a proposal because we wouldn't know how to do it, but my suggestion that our hope for the future is in a revolution in intersubjectivity, that might turn out to mean that we give up the subject-object distinction. But let me say something about how that doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with the first great idea. There might be something wrong with the second, but there would never, I don't see how that would mean that there's anything wrong with the first. If the first great idea is just the idea that the human mind can grasp everything, that idea does not require a subject-object distinction. It's there has to be a distinction between a grasper and the grasped, but there isn't. I don't think that it requires the same sort of distinction between the subjective and the objective, which has created so many problems in modern philosophy. So I guess what I'm suggesting is that I don't, even though I'm perfectly happy to entertain the possibility that a revolution in the study of intersubjectivity will lead us to give up the idea of subject and object, I don't think that that would tell us that there's something wrong with the first grade idea.
Okay. Thank you very much, Linda. This has been wonderful. It has been provocative in the technical sense, provoked a lot of thinking, and we appreciate your coming very much.
Well, thank you. And I'm very happy to see, if there's other questions people want to send me, I'm very happy to, communicate with people about that.
Okay, thank you. And thanks everybody for coming. We had a wonderful crowd, and I'm hearing.
Thank you.
I'm hearing virtual applause on my screen.
Oh, okay. All right. Very good.
Okay. Thanks a lot, everybody.
Thank you.